Ladies and gentlemen, 43 years ago on Thursday, 43 years ago on this coming Thursday, public television unveiled a creation by Lord Morissette entitled Sesame Street, which would end up being the longest running American children's series on television. It was considered, for the educators who are in the room, breakthrough in its production because it was the very first time that educational goals were set in an environmental setting of entertainment. A curriculum was put in place and its effects were thereby measured. Its effects were so positive that it garnered funding from the United States government, because they saw in it the virtue and the value of making a deposit in the early formation of developmental minds that would impact the future generation of citizens of this nation. As a consequence, 95% of all U.S. children, by the time they reach the age of 3, have already seen at least 4 episodes. It's estimated that since that time to this, some 90 million children have been aided in development because of this show. Sesame Street, ladies and gentlemen, has garnered 8 Grammy Awards and 143 Emmys.
Wow.
The producers were intentional on showing a cross-section of the diversity of what America represents. Sesame Street, symbolically and metaphorically, was supposed to represent the great American melting pot, to show that we come from different ethnicities and different cultures and different backgrounds. It was a seed plot that was in fact planted so that children would not be raised with the same prejudice as their parents. And they would be able to see the kind of America that Dr. King dreamed about. Symbolically and psychologically, if you'll look at what was the intentionality that was put in place to help formulate the thinking of America's children. Ernie and Bert were 2 close friends who looked nothing alike but found a common bond. The Count, who in every other sphere of American life would be considered frightening, yet through fear they were able to learn. Oscar the Grouch, who lived in abject poverty, whose address was in a trash can, always seemed to have an attitude adjustment and anger management, simply because of his economic background and how it is that he had been displaced. The signal notion, ladies and gentlemen, was Grover. And Grover, strangely and strikingly, was always found dancing. But he's the only character who was found with no clothes on. Was giving a message that you can rejoice even when you don't have anything. There's something to celebrate even when you cannot compete with designer labels and with name brands. Snuffleupagus was the dim-witted elephant who was always slow, but they waited for him to catch up. Realizing that one should not, in fact, be earmarked for special education, should not be put on prescription medication, and their teachers should not be afraid of their students, but they should take the time for them to catch up. There was Cookie Monster who represented the wealth in America, eating up everything even though they had no teeth, saying that there comes a place where you have to put substance over style. And then there was Big Bird, who had a peculiar body type, who somehow or another didn't fit in but was comfortable in his own skin. And while he didn't fit in, he found the hallmark of leadership. That situation of public television, ladies and gentlemen, represented no degradation, no profiling, no violence, and no stereotype. And then the backdrop of now this new generation who's watching endless hours of cartoons that have sexual overtures and violence on every turn. When the average young person who's 7 years of age has already seen 390 acts of violence on television, then Sesame Street comes in as a welcome breath of fresh air. And last week in the first presidential election debate, one of the contenders, in whom I'll leave nameless because my shoes are off, I found that there was in fact something to be said when he looked into the face of the moderator, Jim Lear, who's been in public television since the foundation of Sesame Street, and said that if in fact he found himself into the Oval Office, he would single-handedly begin to review the cuts. And one of the things that would have to be cut would have to be Sesame Street. And as a consequence, he would kill off Big Bird. The critical question that I need to ask thinking foundational minds tonight is, where would it leave America if we shut down Sesame Street? If Sesame Street represents what we're supposed to look at in diversity, if Sesame Street is supposed to show that there is in fact pride in your own ethnicity, if Sesame Street was supposed to show another generation what you're supposed to look like and embrace when you don't measure up to Vogue magazine, and in the words of William Shakespeare, to thine own self be true. If we do in fact find ourselves on the lower end of the 47%, if we do not have the availability to hide our money on the Cayman Islands, if we can selectively turn in our tax returns at our leisure, where will it leave us if Sesame Street closes? I understand in the backdrop of this ecumenical setting that it is mine then to put it into scriptural praxis. To that end, if Sesame Street closes, America finds itself stuck on the Jericho road. We find ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, that there was a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. And this was, in fact, the sacred place Jerusalem was, because it was the headquarters of the temple. Jerusalem that is sacred to Protestants, Catholics, and even Jews. Jerusalem, where it is that is a sacred place where millions call Mecca, where you go to worship and to give a deference to the one triune God. He's leaving Jerusalem and going to a place that is cursed. And the text says he's going down. There's something that is to be said by General Patton that says when you're going through the valley of the shadow of death, the only option you have is to keep going. Something has happened within the last 4 years that America found itself in a cursed place. In a cursed place because we were in fact losing more than 300,000 jobs a month. In a cursed place because the government could find more funding for prisons than they could for universities. In a cursed place because in places like Harrisburg, you could get more money collecting garbage than you could educating children. In a cursed place where it is that you could find yourself arrested and find yourself going to jail for a vial of crack, but you get probation if you have cocaine in its pure form. It was a cursed place. But somehow or another, we just kept walking. And while we kept walking, something has happened, is that we've fallen amongst thieves. We've fallen amongst thieves who, just like in this narrative, have tried to rob the people of Pennsylvania of the right to vote, tried to steal your dignity, your pride, and your sense of worth, So beating up generations of people who fought to, in fact, repair a broken liberty bell so that it would finally ring liberty and justice for all. Beaten to a pulp that you can, in fact, find Penn State to get millions of dollars in funding while Lincoln University barely scrapes by. Beaten to death, ladies and gentlemen, when we find ourselves in the alleged land of the free and the home of the brave, that Pennsylvania would find itself in dire straits, trying to survive when the thieves came out and then offered us just a small cup of tea and said that we ought to be satisfied with what it is that we have. Strange thing happened is after we were beaten and after it is that we were robbed of our self-esteem, robbed of what it is that we acquired through the Civil Rights Act, through the Fair Housing Act, through having the opportunity to be able to vote and live and to be educated. We were robbed and beaten, but the robbers made one mistake, and their one mistake is that they left us half dead. You do understand, ladies and gentlemen, whenever somebody is left half dead, that you're left with the possibility of being half alive. What it is that they should have done is when they had their hands on us, they should have killed us. They should have threw all of us overboard in the Middle Passage. They should have lynched all of us when they got their hands on Emmett Till. When they unleashed the barking dogs and the fire hoses, they shouldn't have stopped in Birmingham. They should have focused it in Harrisburg. But they made the mistake of leaving us half alive. But they left us half alive. You'll notice that priests passed by. Priests passed by, and as a consequence, this is the fastest growing generation of black people who don't go to church. In 1968, Dick Gregory, the humorist, said that when black people are in trouble, they call on Jesus and the NAACP. But now we're a part of a generation that are not members of the NAACP, and they don't believe in Jesus. Something is to be said because the priests passed them by. There's a group of deluded priests who are passing by the black community who would suggest that because our president has endorsed same-sex unions, that they should not vote. Well, the obvious alternative for these preachers who are derelict in their theological responsibility is the question that has to be raised: if you are against same-sex marriages, are you for polygamy? There is something, ladies and gentlemen, your theology has got to be in order. And so priests passed us by. And after priests passed us by, the Levites passed us by. Levites symbolizing the law. Something is to be said, ladies and gentlemen, when the legal authority has in fact lifted up the blindfold. Because whenever you look at Lady Liberty, she's supposed to be blindfolded. But somehow or another, she has peeked past the blind. And every time a young black man stands before a judge, he immediately goes to jail. There's a contrast difference because if a young man is arrested in the Jewish community, the men go to the judge and say, hand over our son to us and we will discipline him. As a consequence, less than 1% of all prisoners are Jewish, while 12% of the American populace is African American, but 63% of the prison population looks like you and me. What is happening, ladies and gentlemen, when the law passes us by? I think this is a good place for me to remind you that you vote on November 7th, not just for a president, but you also vote for judges. You also vote for mayors and city councilpeople and for congresspeople and for senators. It doesn't matter if the president has hope when the Senate is a nightmare. So something has to be readjusted and put into place. And so here comes this man walking down the Jericho road because Sesame Street is closed. And because Sesame Street is closed, he finds himself endangered. He finds himself in what is called the Bloody Trail that is 17 miles long. And all of a sudden, somebody shows up to pick him up, to give him some aid, to give him a vision, and to restore him. They want to disqualify him because the one who's come to pick him up has no electoral experience. He's got a strange Islamic name. He's a half-breed. His mother is of one ethnicity, and his father represents another lower class. Here comes somebody to pick him up who's saying, it's not for my own personal achievement, but I believe in the words of the Negro spiritual, there's a bright side somewhere. And over my head, I hear music in the air. There must be a God somewhere. He picks him up, ladies and gentlemen, because Sesame Street is closed. And he picks him up on the Jericho road. I would, ladies and gentlemen, because of the writer in this gospel narrative is ambiguous about who it is that picks him up. And because I realize what house I'm in, I'll keep my shoes off. And I won't tell you the name of the man that picks up those who are beaten and those who are disinherited and those who are disenfranchised. I digress. I'm back on the Jericho road. And on the Jericho road, you'll find that there were two blind men who had no vision. And having no vision because they were in fact thrown off of their insurance policy. They were thrown off because they had a pre-existing condition. They said one to another, what are we going to do? Because we have the opportunity, because our voice is our vote. And even if people want to suppress our voice, the more they tell us to be quiet, the louder we're going to scream. Because the people who were telling us not to vote, they had vision. Helen Keller said the only thing worse than being blind is having no vision. And so they begin to scream out, Son of David, have mercy on me. Notice that Jesus now gives to them a blank check. He does not ask them, in the words of many of the erroneous doctrine of prosperity gospel, do you want to be debt free or do you want to be a millionaire? He doesn't ask them, do you want a 10,000 square foot home in the sprawling heights of suburbia? He does not ask them, does he want a 500 S-Class Benz sitting on 22's tinted windows with a Bose stereo in the back? He does not ask them whether he wants red bottom shoes or a Louis spy bag or a Gucci shirt. He does not ask them what it is that they want that is material and tangible. But notice the mind and the mouth of the disinherited. They said, give us our vision. And ladies and gentlemen, the reason why it is that there's a great populace who is trying to sequester